The focus of this paper will be on Thomas More's visit to the Low Countries, his Utopian embassy from May to October of 1515. However, I will start in reverse order from the one suggested in my title with Louvain. To avoid offending my Belgian hosts unnecessarily, I will refer to both the Flemish and French versions of Belgian place names and persons before opting for the most common English one. Can you hear me? No? Okay. All right. Okay, all right, yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, yes, it would be easier. Okay, yeah, I can do that. No problem. I will start with some events that happened before the Utopian mission to give a clearer context. Our story begins about 12 years before with Erasmus's visit to Louvain in 1503-1504 after finishing his theological studies at Paris. At some point during this period, Erasmus seems to have made the acquaintance of Dirk or Thierry Martens, Theodoricus Martinus Alostensis, who established the first printing press in the Low Countries in Aalst, halfway between Brussels and Ghent, in 1473. Later, Martens moved his business first to Antwerp and then to Louvain, though he seems to have moved back and forth between the two cities for a number of years. Martens printed over 50 editions of Erasmus's works, starting in 1503, 1504. Martens was also to publish the first edition of Utopia in Louvain in December 1516. The relationship between Martens and Erasmus was close enough that when Erasmus fell sick in September 1518, shortly after returning from Basel, Martens nursed him at his home for several weeks in Louvain, even though one of the doctors had diagnosed Erasmus's illness as the plague. It was probably through Martens that Erasmus first met a young copy editor named Peter Gillis in Antwerp in 1504. The two became friends, and by the time Moore visited the Low Countries in 1515, Peter Gillis had become the greffier or stadsgreffier or town clerk of Antwerp. Erasmus' second stay in Louvain from 1517 to 1521 was occasioned by the death of his friend and patron Jerome de Busleyden in 1517. Busleyden left money in his will for the founding of the Collegium Trilingue, or Collegium Trium Linguarum. Moore himself met Busleyden in 1515, and Busleyden later, at Erasmus' request, contributed an important prefatory letter to the 1516 Utopia. Erasmus stayed in Louvain for approximately the next 4 years, trying to organize the Collegium and arranging to hire its first instructors in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. From Louvain, Erasmus also made periodic visits to Antwerp and Bruges during this period. Okay, all right, good. In his 1515 letter to Dorp, Moore mentions that he himself had visited the universities of Louvain and Paris in 1508, probably in the fall, though we know nothing about the details of the visit. In his colloquy, the Convivium Profanum, the profane feast, written about 1500 but not published until 1518, Erasmus portrays an even earlier visit by Moore to Paris on his way to Germany. But this is almost certainly pure fiction. Though Moore never seems to have visited Louvain again, during his first Utopian embassy to the Low Countries, he was engaged in controversy with the Louvain theologian Martin van Dorp. Dorp himself was something of a humanist, but had just joined the theological faculty at Louvain and felt compelled to relay their criticisms of Erasmus' Greek New Testament scholarship. Moore's spirited defense of Erasmus, composed in September, October of 1515, seems to have won Dorp over, and he was later reconciled with Erasmus. However, Dorp paid a heavy price for changing sides and eventually had to resign from the theological faculty at Louvain in 1520. And now we turn to Antwerp. We know very little about Moore's visit to Antwerp in 1515. Surprising little beyond what he tells us in the opening pages of Book 1 of Utopia. When Moore first set out for Bruges in May 1515, Erasmus had written to Peter Gillis, telling him that two of his English friends, Cuthbert Tunstall and Thomas Moore, had arrived in Bruges and asking Gillis to do anything he could to help them. But in the event, Moore was not able to go and visit Gillis until mid-September. We know nothing more about Moore's reasons for visiting Antwerp apart from visiting an old friend of Erasmus. However providential, this would turn out to be both for the composition of Utopia and its later publication. Moore mentions, before launching into a brief encomium of Peter Gillis, that Peter was the most welcome among all the other visitors that Moore met with in Antwerp. Who were these other visitors? Edward Surtz, who's still the standard authority on the subject in his 1953 essay, St. Thomas More and the Utopian Embassy, writes, why did Moore make this trip to Antwerp? This was not merely a sightseeing trip. That it was not merely a sightseeing trip is clear from the statement, sic enim res feribat. The Latin is difficult to translate exactly. It means, in effect, that the course of his negotiations took him there. Thomas More apparently was to use his influence to bring the Lords of Antwerp to the vigorous support of the English side. I think there was also a third reason, which I will only deal with briefly since I've dealt with it already elsewhere in published papers, and also intend to devote a chapter to in a book I'm planning to write on Utopia. By the time Moore visited it, the golden age of Antwerp had already begun. As one of the members of the English embassy, Richard Sampson said to Georges de Tempsecke, the leader of the Flemish party in the trade negotiations at Bruges in 1515, Antwerp is now one of the flowers of the world. There were a number of reasons for Antwerp's prosperity, but perhaps the most important was the Portuguese spice trade with India. From the voyage of Cabral onwards in 1501, annual sailings of Portuguese fleets returned from India laden with pepper from South India and cinnamon from Ceylon. It was also in Cabral's 1501 voyage that the Portuguese discovered the Atlantic coast of South America, though they didn't begin to colonize and commercially exploit Brazil until the end of Moore's life.